In the fog-draped streets of Victorian London, where gas lamps cast their amber glow through perpetual mist, and the Thames carried ships laden with discoveries from distant shores, a quiet revolution was taking place in the study of natural history. The year was 1864. And the scientific minds of the age were grappling with questions that seemed to challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. How had life spread across the globe? Why did similar creatures appear on continents separated by vast oceans? What invisible threads connected the far-flung corners of the earth? Among those wrestling with these mysteries was Philip Lutley Sclater, a man whose name would become forever linked to one of the most enduring legends of the modern age. Sclater was not some wild-eyed mystic or spinner of fantastic tales. He was a respected zoologist, a lawyer by training who had turned his considerable intellect to the study of birds and mammals, serving as secretary of the Zoological Society of London for over 4 decades. His offices at 11 Hanover Square had become a meeting place for naturalists from across the British Empire, a clearinghouse for specimens and observations gathered from jungles and mountains, islands and deserts, places where European feet had only recently begun to tread. The puzzle that captured Sclater's attention seemed, at first glance, rather modest. It concerned a group of primates known as lemurs, those large-eyed, long-tailed creatures that moved through trees with an almost ghostly grace. The Victorian definition of lemur was broader than our modern understanding, encompassing not just the animals we know from Madagascar, but also the slender loris of South Asia, creatures with their own peculiar charm and mystery. What troubled Sclater, what kept him awake at night poring over specimen records and distribution maps, was a simple geographic fact that made no sense according to any theory then available. Lemur fossils and living lemurs themselves appeared in great abundance in Madagascar, that enormous island off the eastern coast of Africa. They also appeared in India, thousands of miles to the northeast across the Indian Ocean. Yet in Africa itself, the vast continent that lay between these two populations, lemurs were virtually absent. And in the Middle East, that ancient crossroads where Asia and Africa met, there were no lemurs at all. To understand why this troubled Sclater so deeply, you must understand the intellectual climate of 1864. Charles Darwin's revolutionary work on the origin of species had been published just 5 years earlier, and it had sent shock waves through the scientific establishment that were still reverberating. The idea that species changed over time, that they were not fixed and immutable, but rather evolved through a process of natural selection, was both thrilling and terrifying to the Victorian mind.
If Darwin was correct, then creatures must have originated in specific places and spread outward from those points of origin. The patterns of where animals and plants were found should tell a story, should reveal something about the deep history of life itself. This new science of biogeography promised to map not just the current world, but the hidden pathways of the past. But the lemurs defied simple explanation. If they had evolved in Africa, the closest continent to both Madagascar and India, why were they absent there? If they had evolved in Madagascar, how had they crossed thousands of miles of open ocean to reach the Indian subcontinent? Lemurs, for all their agility in trees, were not known for their swimming prowess. The Mozambique Channel, that stretch of water separating Madagascar from Africa, is over 250 miles wide at its narrowest point. The distance to India is far greater still. No lemur, no matter how determined, could make such a journey. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The fossils spoke clearly. The living populations testified to some connection, some ancient linkage that had since been severed. Sclater's solution, published in the Quarterly Journal of Science, was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. He proposed that Madagascar and India had once been part of a much larger landmass, a continent, that had since broken apart and, in large measure, disappeared beneath the waves. This vanished land would have served as a bridge, allowing lemurs and other creatures to travel freely between regions that are now separated by deep ocean. The eastern portions had become Madagascar, lifted up and preserved as an island refuge. The northern sections had merged with Asia to become India. But the great central mass, the heart of this ancient continent, had subsided into the depths, leaving no trace above the surface. To this hypothetical lost land, Sclater gave a name that was both scientifically appropriate and evocatively poetic. He called it Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution patterns had inspired the theory. It was meant as a technical term, a label for a proposed geological feature that would explain biological observations. Sclater could not have imagined, as he penned those lines in his orderly Victorian study, that he was christening something that would far outgrow its modest scientific origins. He could not have foreseen the forests of legend that would spring from the small seed of speculation. He was simply trying to solve a puzzle, to make sense of the evidence before him using the best tools his age possessed. And in a sense, Sclater was not alone in his thinking. The idea of sunken continents and land bridges was remarkably common in Victorian science. Before the theory of plate tectonics revolutionized our understanding of how the Earth's surface moves and changes, before anyone knew that continents could drift across the globe like massive ships of rock, scientists regularly proposed vanished lands to explain the puzzles they encountered. The French naturalist Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire had speculated about a southern continent connecting Madagascar and India as early as 1840, though he had not given it a name or developed the idea with the thoroughness that Sclater would bring to bear. The English geologist Searles Valentine Wood had hypothesized the existence of a giant southern continent during what they called the Secondary Era, the time of the great reptiles, to explain the distribution of fossil plants and shells. These were not the ravings of fringe thinkers or desperate mystics clinging to discredited ideas. These were serious scientists, respected members of the Royal Society and other august institutions, wrestling with genuine mysteries using the intellectual frameworks available to them. The ocean floors were unknown territory, unmapped and unmappable by the technology of the time. The deepest parts of the sea might as well have been the far side of the moon. It was perfectly reasonable, given what they knew and did not know, to imagine that great land masses might have risen and fallen in the past, that the world's geography had been radically different in ages gone by. The very concept of deep time, the recognition that the Earth was unimaginably ancient, was still new and unsettling. If millions or hundreds of millions of years had passed since the age of trilobites and dinosaurs, who could say what dramatic changes the planet had undergone? Sclater described his Lemuria as occupying parts of both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, stretching from somewhere in the west, perhaps touching the shores of what we now call South America, all the way eastward to encompass the islands of the Indian archipelago. Madagascar and the Mascarene Islands, that small group that includes Mauritius in Reunion, were in his view the surviving highland remnants of this vast continent, the mountain peaks of a drowned world that still poked above the waves. The shape and extent of Lemuria remained vague in Sclater's original proposal, a rough sketch rather than a detailed map, but the core idea was clear. Where there was now only ocean, there had once been land. Where ships now sailed over abyssal depths, creatures had once walked on solid ground beneath open sky. The theory was not universally accepted, of course. Science rarely works through immediate consensus. But it gained considerable traction in certain circles, particularly among those trying to understand the distribution of plants and animals across the southern hemisphere. It appeared in academic journals and textbooks. Other naturalists cited Sclater's work and built upon it. For a time, Lemuria took its place among the respectable, if speculative, theories that scientists debated in lecture halls and discussed over tea. It was biogeography, attempting to read the book of nature and decipher the movements of life across deep time. And then something remarkable happened, something that Sclater certainly never intended and probably would have found disturbing. His scientific hypothesis was about to escape from the confines of zoological journals and natural history societies. It was about to become something else entirely, something far stranger and more powerful than a simple explanation for the distribution of lemurs. The theory was about to meet a man named Ernst Haeckel, and in that meeting it would begin its transformation from a geographic proposal into a legend about the very origins of humanity itself. Ernst Henrik Philipp August Haeckel was one of the most influential biologists of the late 19th century, though his name is less familiar today than those of Darwin or Mendel. Born in Potsdam in 1834, Haeckel was a man of vast enthusiasms and considerable talents. He was not merely a scientist, but an artist of remarkable skill, creating intricate illustrations of microscopic organisms and marine life that were both scientifically accurate and aesthetically stunning. His drawings of radiolarians, those tiny single-celled creatures with their impossibly complex geometric skeletons, remain marvels of scientific illustration to this day, looking more like the work of some visionary architect than depictions of actual living things. Haeckel was also a devoted champion of Charles Darwin's theory, perhaps its most vocal advocate in Germany. He corresponded with Darwin himself and worked tirelessly to spread and expand upon the ideas of natural selection and descent with modification. But Haeckel was not content to merely repeat Darwin's ideas. He had theories of his own, grand synthetic visions that attempted to unify all of biology under a single explanatory framework. He coined many terms still used in biology today, words like ecology, phylum, and phylogeny. He was, in many ways, a systematic genius, someone who saw patterns and connections everywhere he looked. When Haeckel encountered Sclater's theory of Lemuria around 1870, he immediately grasped its potential for solving another puzzle that troubled evolutionary biologists. If humans had evolved from more primitive ancestors, as Darwin's theory suggested, then where were the fossils of those intermediate forms? Where was the famous missing link between modern humans and the apes? Fossil hunters had searched diligently, but found frustratingly little. The human fossil record of the Victorian era was sparse and fragmentary, nothing like the rich deposits of trilobites or ammonites that could be found in the right strata.
This absence of evidence gave ammunition to Darwin's critics, those who argued that if humans really had evolved from ape-like ancestors, there should be clear transitional fossils marking each stage of that transformation. Haeckel proposed an answer that was both simple and spectacular. Perhaps the missing link wasn't missing at all. Perhaps it simply wasn't available to be found because it lay beneath the waves, entombed in the depths of the Indian Ocean. If Lemuria had existed, and if it had then sunk beneath the sea, it might have taken the evidence of human evolution down with it. The probable primeval home of humanity, Haeckel argued, should be sought in a lost continent that was now underwater, inaccessible to the pickaxes and brushes of paleontologists. He placed his hypothetical human origins in Lemuria, in the warm tropical regions around the Indian Ocean, during what they called the Tertiary period, the age of mammals that had followed the extinction of the dinosaurs. This was a dramatic expansion of Lemuria's meaning and significance. No longer was it merely an explanation for lemur distribution, a footnote in biogeographical debates. Now it was potentially the cradle of humanity itself, the Garden of Eden made geological fact, the paradise from which our species had first emerged.
Haeckel's proposal transformed Lemuria from a scientific hypothesis into something that touched on the most profound questions humans could ask. Where did we come from? What were our earliest ancestors like? Was there really a time and place when humanity first opened its eyes and looked up at the stars? The idea spread through popular scientific literature with remarkable speed. Haeckel was a prolific writer, and his works reached audiences far beyond the scientific community. His History of Creation, published in numerous editions and translated into many languages, brought his theories to a vast readership hungry for explanations of human origins in the wake of Darwin's revolutionary ideas. In that book and in his other writings, Lemuria appeared not as a tentative hypothesis, but as a confident assertion, mapped and described with a certainty that the evidence did not really support. Haeckel drew pictures showing Lemuria's supposed extent, placed it specifically in the Indian Ocean between Asia and Africa, and populated it with the ancestors of modern humans making their first faltering steps toward civilization. For many people, particularly those eager to reconcile evolutionary theory with their existing worldviews, Haeckel's Lemuria was immensely appealing. It provided a specific answer to the question of where humans had evolved. It explained why the fossil evidence was lacking. It placed human origins in a tropical paradise that had since been destroyed, which resonated with religious and mythological traditions about lost golden ages in primeval gardens. Even the famous British author H.G. Wells, writing in his Outline of History in 1919, entertained the possibility that human ancestors might have developed in some region now submerged beneath the Mediterranean Sea or the Indian Ocean during the ice ages that had shaped the northern continents. But Haeckel's appropriation of Lemuria also marked the beginning of its slow drift away from rigorous science. Haeckel was not always careful about distinguishing between what was known and what was speculated. His beautiful diagrams and confident prose gave an impression of certainty that the actual evidence did not warrant. He was constructing a narrative as much as reporting findings, and narratives have their own momentum, their own desires that can lead them away from the strict disciplines of empirical investigation. The door was opening just slightly for Lemuria to become something more than a scientific theory. It was becoming a story, and stories have a life of their own. Still, at this stage, Lemuria remained within the broad bounds of scientific discourse, debated in journals and lecture halls, critiqued and defended with reference to fossil distributions and geological theories. It would take another, more dramatic intervention to truly transform Lemuria from a questionable scientific hypothesis into a full-fledged myth. That intervention would come from a most unlikely source, a Russian woman of aristocratic birth who had reinvented herself as a spiritual teacher and who would take Sclater's modest land bridge and Haeckel's primeval home and transmute them into something that neither man could have imagined in their wildest dreams. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was not a woman who believed in doing things by halves. Born in Ukraine in 1831 to a family of German and Russian nobility, she lived a life that seemed designed to defy every Victorian convention of proper feminine behavior. She traveled extensively, allegedly studying with spiritual masters in Tibet and India, though the details of her journeys remain shrouded in mystery and controversy. She was married twice, both times briefly. She worked as a concert pianist, a circus bareback rider, a businesswoman, and a spiritualist medium. She was by turns charismatic and infuriating, inspiring fierce devotion in her followers and equally fierce skepticism in her critics. In the 1870s, Blavatsky found herself in the United States, living for a time on Sansom Street in Philadelphia, within what would later become the boundaries of the University of Pennsylvania campus. It was there, during a serious illness that left her with an infected leg and delirious with fever, that she experienced what she described as a spiritual transformation. In the grip of that fever, in the borderlands between consciousness and dreams, she claimed to have received revelations about the true nature of reality, the hidden history of humanity, and the spiritual laws that governed the universe.
When she recovered, she was a woman with a mission. She would found the Theosophical Society,
an organization dedicated to exploring the mystical traditions underlying all the world's religions and uncovering the ancient wisdom that she believed had been lost or hidden from the masses. Blavatsky was a voracious reader, someone who consumed books on everything from ancient mythology to cutting-edge science. She had encountered Haeckel's writings, and through them learned of Slater's Lemuria. The concept fascinated her, but not for the reasons it interested zoologists or paleontologists. She saw in Lemuria something far more profound than an explanation for lemur fossils. She saw a piece of the hidden history of human spiritual evolution, a chapter in the great cosmic drama that she believed she had been chosen to reveal to the world. In 1888, after years of labor, Blavatsky published her magnum opus, a massive 2-volume work titled The Secret Doctrine. The subtitle proclaimed it to be the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, and Blavatsky clearly intended it as nothing less than a complete cosmology, a unified theory of everything spiritual and material. The books were dense, sprawling, often contradictory, filled with references to ancient texts, both genuine and questionable, drawing on Sanskrit scriptures, Egyptian mythology, Greek philosophy, Christian mysticism, and modern science in equal measure. They were also enormously influential, becoming founding documents of the modern occult revival and shaping the spiritual landscape of the 20th century in ways that are still visible today. Central to The Secret Doctrine was Blavatsky's theory of root races, a concept that would forever change what Lemuria meant. According to Blavatsky, humanity did not evolve in the gradual linear fashion that Darwinian evolution suggested. Instead, human history proceeded through a series of 7 great cycles, 7 root races that appeared one after another on Earth, each representing a distinct stage in spiritual and physical development. These were not races in the modern sense of ethnic groups, but rather vast eons of time during which humanity existed in dramatically different forms and possessed different levels of consciousness. The first root race, according to Blavatsky, was barely physical at all. These were ethereal beings, invisible and insubstantial, more like thought forms than flesh and blood creatures. They did not eat or reproduce in any conventional sense. They were spirit, gradually condensing toward matter, the first tentative expression of human consciousness in the material world. They existed, she claimed, in a time when Earth itself was still cooling and forming, when the world was more like a dream than a physical planet. The second root race were the Hyperboreans, named after a legendary land in the far north mentioned in Greek mythology.
These beings were still not fully physical in Blavatsky's telling, but they had begun to develop bodies of a sort. They were golden yellow in color, she claimed, and lived in regions that are now the far northern reaches of the planet, areas encompassing parts of Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Scandinavia, and northern Russia. They reproduced by a process she compared to budding, like simple organisms dividing to create offspring. The world they inhabited was warmer than our modern Arctic, enjoying an eternal spring before the shifting of Earth's axis brought seasons and cold to the poles. But it was the third root race that would concern us most, for these were the Lemurians, and their story would eclipse everything that Sclater or Haeckel had ever imagined. In Blavatsky's cosmology, the Lemurians represented the first truly human civilization, the first root race to possess physical bodies that we might recognize as similar to our own, though they were strange and wondrous by modern standards. They inhabited a vast continent that Blavatsky called Lemuria, acknowledging Sclater's term while transforming its meaning entirely. This continent, in her description, extended from the Indian Ocean all the way across the Pacific
encompassing parts of what is now Asia, Australia, and various Pacific islands. It was the dominant landmass of that ancient age, dwarfing the other continents in size and importance. The Lemurians themselves, as Blavatsky described them, were beings of almost unimaginable strangeness. They stood 15 feet tall, towering giants compared to modern humans. Their faces were flat and broad, with eyes that could look sideways like birds, able to see in directions that would be impossible for us. Most remarkably, in their earliest forms, the Lemurians were hermaphroditic, possessing both male and female reproductive organs. They laid eggs rather than giving birth to live young, and could reproduce without needing a partner. Some accounts even describe them as having 4 arms, though this may have been a later embellishment or a description of an early subrace within the Lemurian epic. These were not mere primitive humans, however. Blavatsky insisted that despite their strange physical forms, the Lemurians possessed abilities and knowledge that modern humans had lost. They were spiritually pure, she claimed, living in harmony with nature and the cosmos in ways that our civilization had forgotten. They could communicate telepathically, had some degree of control over natural forces, and possessed what might be called psychic powers, though Blavatsky was careful to frame these as natural abilities that humanity would one day recover, rather than supernatural gifts. They lived alongside the last of the dinosaurs in Blavatsky's chronology, witnessing the final days of the great reptiles before those creatures vanished from the earth. The downfall of the Lemurians came, according to the secret doctrine, through their discovery of sexuality.
In their hermaphroditic state, reproduction had been a simple, almost mechanical process, free from desire or passion. But at some point in their long history, the Lemurians began to separate into distinct sexes, into males and females who needed each other to reproduce. With that separation came the awakening of sexual desire, and with desire came attachment, jealousy, possessiveness, all the complications that Blavatsky saw as marking the beginning of humanity's fall from spiritual grace. The Lemurians became, in her telling, corrupted by their new awareness of sex and the physical pleasures of the body. They turned away from spiritual development and toward sensual gratification. The spiritual corruption, Blavatsky claimed, had physical consequences. The continent of Lemuria was destroyed, not by natural geological processes alone, but by a catastrophe that was in some sense moral and karmic, a result of the Lemurians' spiritual failings. Volcanic eruptions and earthquakes tore the great continent apart. The land subsided into the ocean in a series of cataclysms that must have been terrible beyond imagining. Most of the Lemurians perished in these disasters. Their cities were swallowed by the sea. Their civilization vanished beneath the waves. Only scattered remnants survived, fragments of the great continent that remained above water. These remnants, Blavatsky asserted, were what we now know as Easter Island and Australia, though even these were greatly diminished versions of their former extent. The descendants of the Lemurians survived in these places, but they had degenerated from their former glory. They had become what Blavatsky, in language that reflected the unfortunate racial theories of her time, called semi-animal creatures. She pointed to the indigenous peoples of Tasmania, parts of Australia, and various Pacific islands as the degraded descendants of the once mighty Lemurian race. Humans who had lost the spiritual heights their ancestors had achieved and retained only dim echoes of that former greatness. This narrative was deeply troubling in many ways, particularly in how it incorporated and reinforced racist hierarchies under the guise of spiritual evolution. Blavatsky's scheme placed European peoples, whom she associated with the later fifth root race called the Aryans, at a higher level of development than indigenous populations around the world. It was a cosmic justification for colonialism, suggesting that some peoples were literally less evolved than others, throwbacks to earlier stages of human development.
These aspects of Theosophy's teachings have been rightly criticized and rejected by modern scholars and even by many who otherwise find value in some theosophical ideas. But in the context of 1880s, when such views were sadly common across much of Western thought, Blavatsky's ideas found a receptive audience.
The Lemurians in Blavatsky's vision were followed by a fourth root race, the Atlanteans, who developed on the continent of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. They too were more advanced than modern humanity in some ways, possessing technologies and knowledge that had been lost. They too eventually fell, destroyed in another great cataclysm that sent their continent beneath the waves. And from the ruins of Atlantis emerged the fifth root race, the Aryans, which included most of modern humanity. 2 more root races were yet to come, Blavatsky prophesied, stages of even greater spiritual development that would occur in future millennia as humanity continued its long ascent toward divine consciousness. Where had Blavatsky obtained this elaborate history? She claimed that her information came from ancient texts called the Stanzas of Zion, supposedly preserved in hidden monasteries in Tibet and shown to her by spiritual masters whom she called Mahatmas. These masters, perfected humans who had transcended the normal limitations of mortality, had allegedly permitted her to view this secret scripture and had helped her decode its symbolism to reveal the true history of the earth and humanity. The Book of Zion, she insisted, predated all other scriptures, recording knowledge from before the destruction of Atlantis, from the very dawn of human consciousness. Skeptics, both in her own time and since, have questioned whether these texts ever existed outside Blavatsky's imagination. No independent scholar has ever seen the original stanzas of Zion. Linguistic experts who have examined Blavatsky's quotations from them have found the language to be inconsistent and showing signs of modern construction rather than ancient origin. It seems likely that Blavatsky, who was certainly capable of creative invention, constructed at least some of this material herself, drawing on genuine Buddhist and Hindu texts, but embellishing and transforming them to suit her purposes. Whether she did this consciously, as deliberate fraud, or whether she genuinely believed in the reality of her visions, is a question that has never been definitively answered. What is certain is that Blavatsky's secret doctrine was enormously influential. The Theosophical Society spread across the world, establishing lodges in Europe, America, India, and beyond. Her books were translated into numerous languages and read by thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people. Many who encountered her ideas were respectable, educated individuals, artists and writers, scientists and philosophers, people who found in Theosophy a framework that seemed to reconcile spiritual yearnings with scientific progress, that promised ancient wisdom while embracing evolutionary development. The composer Gustav Mahler was interested in Theosophy. The painter Vasily Kandinsky found inspiration in its teachings. The poet William Butler Yeats was a member of the Theosophical Society for a time. Some accounts suggest that even Albert Einstein may have encountered Blavatsky's works and attended lectures by Rudolf Steiner, who had begun as a theosophist before founding his own related movement called anthroposophy, though the extent of Einstein's engagement with these ideas remains a matter of scholarly debate. Rudolf Steiner added his own elaborate details to the story of Lemuria. According to Steiner's clairvoyant investigations, which he claimed allowed him to read the Akashic records, a kind of cosmic memory bank containing all that has ever happened, the Lemurians had bodies that were soft and malleable, not rigidly fixed in form like ours. They could modify their physical appearance through will and concentration, reshaping themselves as needed. They lacked well-developed memory, Steiner claimed, and therefore had no complex language as we understand it. Their consciousness was different from ours, more dreamlike and instinctive, more connected to the spiritual realms that surrounded them. The Lemurian epic ended, in Steiner's telling, through great volcanic catastrophes, walls of fire and rivers of lava that consumed their cities and their lands. But before the end came,
a group of Lemurians were saved by divine guidance, led to safety, to become the seed from which the next root race, the Atlanteans, would grow. William Scott Elliott, another theosophist who wrote extensively about the lost continents, provided yet more details in his book, The Lost Lemuria, published in 1904. He relocated Lemuria primarily to the Pacific Ocean, stretching across what is now open water between Asia and the Americas. His Lemurians were brown-skinned giants, 15 feet tall, as Blavatsky had claimed, but with flat faces and the curious ability to walk backwards and forwards with equal ease. Their eyes were positioned to provide sideways vision, he reiterated, and they reproduced by laying eggs in the manner of birds or reptiles. Most remarkably, Scott Elliott claimed that the Lemurians had engaged in interbreeding with animals, and that the offspring of these unnatural unions had given rise to apes, making the Lemurians responsible for creating the very creatures that would later be mistaken for human ancestors. These elaborations might seem fantastical, and indeed they were, but they were presented with an air of authority and backed by claims of spiritual investigation that gave them credence among believers. The descriptions became more detailed and specific with each retelling, as if the continued clairvoyant research of theosophists was gradually recovering more and more information about this vanished world. Maps were drawn, showing Lemuria's extent at different periods of its history. Timelines were constructed placing the Lemurian epoch tens of millions of years in the past.
The society itself was described as having passed through various stages, with different subraces developing specialized abilities and migrating to different parts of the continent. Some Lemurians were said to have built the first cities out of stone and lava, massive structures whose ruins, it was suggested, might still be found if one knew where to look. The legend took yet another form through the work of James Churchward, a British inventor and occult writer born in 1851. Churchward led a remarkably varied life, working as a tea planter in Sri Lanka before immigrating to the United States in the 1890s. He became a successful inventor, holding patents for NCV steel, a type of armor plating used to protect ships during the First World War. After receiving a substantial settlement from a patent dispute in 1914, he retired to a 7-acre estate in Lakeville, Connecticut, where he devoted himself to answering questions that had emerged during his extensive travels across the Pacific. In 1926, at the age of 75, Churchward published what would become his most influential work, The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man. He claimed that decades earlier, while serving in India, he had befriended a high-ranking temple priest who showed him a set of ancient clay tablets. These tablets, supposedly written in a long-lost language Churchward called the Nagamaya tongue, could be read by only a handful of people in all of India. The priest agreed to teach Churchward this dead language, and through years of study, Churchward claimed to have deciphered the tablets, which told the story of an ancient land called Mu. Churchward's Mu was essentially Lemuria, relocated and vastly expanded. He placed it firmly in the Pacific Ocean, stretching from somewhere north of Hawaii, southward as far as Fiji and Easter Island, covering nearly half the Pacific. According to his translations, Mu had been enormous, larger than South America, with a population of 64 million people at its height. This was the true motherland of humanity, Churchward insisted, the original location of the Garden of Eden, the place from which all human civilization had ultimately sprung. The continent was ruled by a king named Ra, and this, Churchward argued, explained why sun worship and symbols of the sun appeared in ancient cultures around the world, from Egypt to Peru. All were remembering their Muian origins. In Churchward's cosmology, Mu was the mother civilization that had established colonies across the globe. Egypt, Babylon, the civilizations of Central America, the cultures of India and Burma, all of these were offshoots of the Muian Empire, founded by colonists who carried their advanced knowledge to distant shores. The megalithic architecture found throughout Polynesia, the Moai statues of Easter Island in particular, were remnants of Muian construction.
Churchward claimed that the cylindrical stone topknots atop some moai, which he incorrectly described as made of red sandstone, represented the sun god Ra, worshipped by the people of Mu. According to Churchward's account, Mu was destroyed approximately 12,000 years ago in a catastrophic event. The continent did not merely sink, but was torn apart by volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, submerged beneath 50 million square miles of ocean water. Only a few scattered islands remained above the surface, fragments of the once mighty landmass. Those who survived the cataclysm carried memories of their lost homeland, and these memories, Churchward believed, appeared in the flood myths and lost paradise legends found in cultures worldwide. Churchward supported his claims with an eclectic array of evidence, much of which has since been thoroughly discredited. He cited stone tablets reportedly discovered in Mexico by an individual named William Niven, though the authenticity of these tablets remains highly questionable. He offered his own translations of Mayan codices, interpreting them as references to Mu, though modern Maya scholars have shown his translations to be fundamentally mistaken, based on misunderstandings of Mayan writing systems. He pointed to similarities in ancient symbols and architectural styles across different cultures as proof of their common Muian origin, though these similarities can be explained through universal patterns in human creativity or through well-documented historical contacts between cultures. Despite the weakness of his evidence, or perhaps because his narrative was so comprehensive and confident, Churchward's books found a substantial readership. He published several follow-up volumes, including The Children of Mu in 1931 and The Sacred Symbols of Mu in 1933, each adding more detail to his mythology. The story of Mu merged with and largely absorbed the earlier Lemuria legends, so that many people came to use the names interchangeably, though purists sometimes insisted they were distinct continents that existed simultaneously before both sinking in separate catastrophes. The legend of Mu spread particularly in regions around the Pacific. Some Turkish scholars in the 1930s, including reportedly Mustafa Kemal Ataturk himself, express interest in Churchward's theories as a possible explanation for the ancient homeland of the Turkish people, though this interest apparently did not progress beyond initial examination. In the decades that followed, Mu became a staple of alternative archaeology and occult literature, appearing in countless books, documentaries, and fringe scientific theories, each adding its own embellishments to Churchward's already elaborate mythology. And this is where the story takes another turn, another transformation that carried Lemuria even further from its origins in Philip Sclater's zoological journals. Because if Lemuria had really existed, if it had been home to an advanced civilization before sinking beneath the Pacific, then surely there should be evidence. Surely somewhere, in some form, traces of the Lemurians should have survived. And if the continent itself was gone, drowned in the abyssal depths of the ocean, might there not have been survivors? Might some Lemurians have escaped the catastrophe, fleeing to lands that remained above water? And if so, where might those survivors have gone? Where might their descendants be found today? The answer to these questions would come from an unlikely source, from a teenager in California who claimed to be writing under the direction of a spirit from beyond the grave. His name was Frederick Spencer Oliver, though the world would know him better by the pen name he claimed for his otherworldly collaborator. And his book, published in 1894 when Oliver was barely out of his youth, would forever link the legend of Lemuria to a specific location in the physical world, a mountain that rises stark and solitary from the forests of Northern California, a peak that had long been sacred to the indigenous peoples of the region and would now become sacred to spiritual seekers from around the world. Mount Shasta stands 14,179 feet above sea level, a massive stratovolcano that dominates the landscape of Siskiyou County. It is visible for 100 miles in any direction on clear days, a perfect cone of stone and snow that seems to float above the horizon like something from a dream.
To the Native American peoples who had lived in its shadow for thousands of years, Mount Shasta was a sacred place, the dwelling of powerful spirits and the center of creation stories. The Klamath people told of Skell, a mighty spirit who descended from the sky to the mountain's summit and who fought there with Liao, the spirit of the below world who lived at Mount Masama to the north. Their battle, which involved hurling hot rocks and molten lava at each other, was remembered as volcanic eruptions that had shaped the landscape. The mountain was a thin place, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew permeable, where one had to be careful, because the forces at work were ancient and powerful. Frederick Spencer Oliver was born in Eureka, a small town in the shadow of Mount Shasta, in 1866. As a teenager, he began experiencing episodes of automatic writing, his hand seeming to move of its own accord, producing page after page of text that he claimed came not from his own mind, but from an entity calling itself Philos the Thebetan, described sometimes as a spirit, sometimes as an ascended master, a being who had lived many lifetimes and achieved a level of spiritual development that allowed him to communicate across the veil of death. Over several years, Philos allegedly dictated to Oliver a massive manuscript that would be published in 1894 under the title A Dweller on Two Planets. The book was a curious mixture of spiritualist philosophy, reincarnation narratives, and science fiction-like descriptions of advanced technology. Its central story involved past lives in Atlantis and reincarnations in 19th century America, complete with electric airships and death rays, predictions about television and atomic energy, mixed with moral lessons about karma and spiritual development. But what interests us, what would prove most influential for the development of the Lemuria legend, was a relatively brief section where Philos mentioned in passing that Mount Shasta concealed a hidden city, and that this city was inhabited by survivors from the lost continent of Lemuria. According to Oliver's account, when Lemuria sank beneath the Pacific Ocean in some ancient catastrophe, a group of Lemurians had managed to escape. They had fled eastward, making their way to the western coast of North America, and there they had discovered Mount Shasta. The mountain, with its caverns carved by ancient lava flows, with its enormous bulk and remote location, offered perfect sanctuary. The Lemurians, using their advanced knowledge and perhaps their spiritual powers, had excavated vast chambers inside the mountain, creating an underground city of wondrous beauty. The walls were encrusted with jewels, Oliver claimed, and the floors were carpeted with fur. Crystal lights illuminated the passages. Advanced machinery maintained comfortable temperature and fresh air. And there the Lemurians had lived ever since, hidden from the surface world, occasionally emerging, but generally keeping themselves separate from the later inhabitants of the land. Oliver's Lemurians were not the bizarre giants of Blavatsky's vision. They were more human in scale and appearance, though still possessing the spiritual advancement and esoteric knowledge of their race. They dressed in white robes, he said, and sometimes walked the surface of the mountain at night, appearing as mysterious figures who could vanish back into hidden doorways when observed. They were benevolent, offering guidance to worthy seekers, but generally avoiding contact with ordinary humanity who would not understand their nature or their purpose. The book attracted little attention when it was first published. Oliver's automatic writing and his melodramatic prose style did not find a wide audience immediately. But the seed had been planted. The connection between Mount Shasta and Lemuria had been made. And over the following decades, as interest in lost continents and occult wisdom grew, that connection would be discovered and embraced by others who would elaborate on it, expand it, and make Mount Shasta into one of the most significant centers of metaphysical belief in North America.
In 1913, Edgar Lucien Larkin, a writer and astronomer, published an article reviewing Oliver's book and lending it a degree of scientific respectability it probably did not deserve. Larkin worked at Mount Lowe Observatory in California, giving him credentials that impressed readers unfamiliar with the difference between astronomy and the investigation of hidden underground cities. His endorsement of Oliver's claims helped spread the story to a wider audience. Then, in 1925, a writer using the pseudonym Selvius published an article in a journal called The Mystic Triangle, titled Descendants of Lemuria, a description of an ancient cult in America. This article was entirely devoted to the Lemurian village supposedly hidden inside Mount Shasta, and it included the sensational claim that Larkin had actually seen the Lemurian settlement through his telescope, observing their buildings and activities from his distant vantage point. Whether Larkin actually made such a claim is unclear. In 1939, a botanist named William Cook, who lived in Mount Shasta, expressed considerable skepticism about whether any telescope could reveal structures inside a mountain and questioned the entire legend. But by then, the damage, if we can call it that, was done. The story had spread too far and taken root too deeply to be easily dismissed by rational objections. In 1931, Harvey Spencer Lewis, the founder of the ancient mystical order Rosicrucius, better known as the Rosicrucians, published a widely read book under the pseudonym Wishar S. Serve, titled Lemuria, the Lost Continent of the Pacific. This book incorporated and expanded upon the Selvius material, adding new details and presenting the Lemurian presence at Mount Shasta as established fact rather than speculation. According to these accounts, the Lemurians of Mount Shasta were tall and graceful, 7 feet in height, with noble features and an air of serene dignity. They wore white robes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Some descriptions said they wore unusual headdresses with decorations that came down over their foreheads to the bridge of their noses, covering or concealing part of their faces in ways that suggested they might be hiding some unusual anatomical feature, perhaps a third eye or some organ of psychic perception. They occasionally came down from the mountain to trade gold nuggets and gold dust for supplies in the small towns of the region, conducting their transactions quickly and then departing before too many questions could be asked. They spoke English, it was said, though with an odd accent that no one could quite place. The most detailed modern elaboration of the Mount Shasta Lemurian story would come much later, in the late 20th century, from writers and channelers who claimed to be in contact with the inhabitants of what they called Telos, the name given to the underground city.
Diane Robbins and Aurelia Louise Jones both published books in the 1990s and early 2000s that purported to contain telepathic transmissions from the Telosians, as the Mount Shasta Lemurians were now called. According to these sources, Telos was a vast multi-level city built before Lemuria sank, constructed using advanced technology that modern humanity has not rediscovered. It was designed to house 200,000 Lemurians, though current population estimates given by channelers range up to 1.5 million inhabitants. Aurelia Louise Jones, in particular, promoted the figure of Adama, described as the high priest of Telos, a wise and benevolent leader who supposedly communicated messages of love, unity, and spiritual ascension to surface dwellers ready to receive them. These messages emphasize themes common in New Age spirituality, like the power of unconditional love, the importance of raising one's vibrational frequency, the coming shift to fifth-dimensional consciousness, and the interconnectedness of all beings. The Telosians were portrayed as guardians of ancient Lemurian wisdom, holding themselves ready to help humanity through the challenging transition into a new age of enlightenment. The physical description of the Telosians in these modern accounts varied. Some described them as essentially human in appearance, perhaps taller than average and with an unusual luminosity to their skin and eyes, but recognizably people. Others gave them more exotic characteristics, including telepathic abilities so advanced that they rarely needed to use spoken language, the capacity to become invisible or to move through solid matter, and lifespans measured in centuries or even millennia, thanks to their advanced spiritual development and mastery of the body's energetic systems. They were said to use crystals for everything from communication to healing to power generation, tapping into natural earth energies in ways that modern technology, with its dependence on fossil fuels, had never learned. The city of Telos itself was described in loving detail by those who claimed to have visited it in meditation or astral travel.
The main levels were said to be enormous, miles in extent, lit by a soft radiance that came from no visible source but seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Gardens grew beneath the mountain, nourished by that mysterious light, producing fruits and vegetables of surpassing beauty and nutritional perfection. Crystal temples provided spaces for meditation and spiritual practice. Libraries preserved records not only of Lemuria, but of all Earth's history, including ages that surface humanity had completely forgotten. There were healing chambers where the sick could be restored to perfect health. There were schools where children learned not only conventional subjects, but also how to develop their psychic gifts and spiritual awareness.
Access to Telos was said to be restricted not by physical barriers, but by vibrational frequencies. Only those whose consciousness had reached a certain level of development could perceive the doorways into the mountain or navigate the passages to the city. It was not that the Telosians were trying to keep people out exactly, but rather that most surface dwellers operated at a frequency that made the higher dimensions where Telos existed simply invisible to them. It was a matter of perception, of consciousness. Raise your vibration high enough, develop your spiritual sensitivity sufficiently, and the way would open. This conveniently explained why no one had ever found definitive physical proof of the city. Those who were ready would find it. Those who were not ready would see only stone and ice, caverns and snow. The Native American peoples of the Mount Shasta region watched these developments with feelings that ranged from bemusement to frustration. The mountain was indeed sacred to them, had been for longer than anyone could remember, but their traditions spoke of different things than Lemurians and crystal cities. They spoke of spirits and ancestors, of the mountain as a living presence with its own consciousness and power. The influx of New Age seekers, with their crystals and their channeled messages, and their conviction that they possessed ancient wisdom, sometimes seemed to the indigenous peoples like just another form of colonization. Another way that white people took something that belonged to someone else and made it their own, reframing it in terms that made sense to them, but erasing or ignoring the actual people who had been there first. Colleen Sisk, leader of the Winnemem Wintu tribe, has spoken about how the Wintu came out of Mount Shasta, how the mountain is their origin place, how they are obligated to be its watchers and protectors. When asked about the New Age beliefs surrounding the mountain, about Lemurians and UFOs and all the rest, she has expressed a philosophy of tolerance mixed with concern. People are entitled to their beliefs, she has said, but those beliefs should not damage the mountain or disrespect the traditions of those who have been its guardians for millennia. When a mysterious 60-foot hole appeared on the side of Mount Shasta in the 2010s, dug by unknown persons and clearly the result of considerable effort, many assumed it had been excavated by those seeking an entrance to Telos. The Forest Service eventually filled it in, but the incident highlighted the tensions between different groups who all saw the mountain as special, but for very different reasons. Meanwhile, the scientific origin of the Lemuria concept, the zoological puzzle that had started this entire chain of speculation, was being definitively resolved in a way that left no room for sunken continents in the Pacific or Indian Oceans.
The revolution came from an unlikely source, from a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener, who in 1912 proposed a radical theory that was initially met with widespread skepticism and even ridicule. Wegener suggested that the continents were not fixed in place, but rather drifted across the surface of the Earth like massive rafts of lighter rock floating on a denser substrate. He called his idea continental drift, and he supported it with a remarkable array of evidence, from the jigsaw puzzle fit of the coastlines of Africa and South America to the discovery of identical fossils and rock formations on continents now separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The scientific establishment of Wegener's time rejected his ideas almost unanimously. The notion that continents could move seemed absurd, impossible. What force could possibly push around such enormous masses of rock? How could the solid earth beneath our feet be mobile in this way?
Wegener died in 1930 while on an expedition to Greenland, his theory still unaccepted by the majority of geologists. But the evidence he had gathered would not go away. Other researchers continued to investigate, and in the decades following his death, the proof accumulated. Magnetic surveys of the ocean floor revealed patterns that made sense only if the seafloor was spreading, if new crust was being created at mid-ocean ridges, and old crust was being destroyed at deep ocean trenches. The study of earthquakes revealed that the Earth's outer shell was broken into large plates that moved relative to each other. By the 1960s, the theory of plate tectonics, the mature form of Wegener's continental drift, was being accepted by virtually all Earth scientists, and plate tectonics explained everything that Sclater's Lemuria had been invented to explain, but explained it better and with far more evidence. Madagascar and India had indeed once been connected, but not through a sunken land bridge called Lemuria. They had been part of Gondwana, a supercontinent that also included Antarctica, Australia, South America, and Africa. This enormous landmass had begun to break apart over 100 million years ago, driven by the movement of tectonic plates powered by convection in the Earth's mantle. India broke away and drifted northward over tens of millions of years, eventually colliding with Asia and raising the Himalayan mountains in that titanic impact. Madagascar separated from Africa much earlier, but remained relatively close to its original position. The lemurs and other creatures, whose distribution had so puzzled Sclater, had simply been isolated on these separating land masses, evolving independently after the connections were severed.
There was no need for a sunken continent. The continents themselves had moved, carrying their passengers with them, and that movement explained the geological and biological patterns far better than any hypothesis involving lands rising and falling in the oceans. Moreover, the geological study of the ocean floors made it clear that sunken continents of the type imagined by Sclater, Haeckel, Blavatsky, and Churchward were physically impossible. Continental crust is fundamentally different from oceanic crust. It is lighter, less dense, made primarily of rocks rich in silicon and aluminum that geologists call sial. Oceanic crust is denser, made of rocks rich in silicon and magnesium called sima. Continental crust floats higher on the mantle beneath precisely because it is lighter. A continent cannot simply sink into the ocean and disappear because its rock is literally too buoyant to do so. The only way a large landmass can become submerged is if sea levels rise dramatically, or if tectonic processes subduct it beneath another plate over millions of years, not in a sudden catastrophe. The Pacific Ocean islands that had been proposed as remnants of Lemuria were not continental fragments at all. They were volcanic peaks, the tops of underwater mountains formed by hotspots in the mantle or by volcanic activity at plate boundaries. Easter Island, that isolated speck of land so often cited as a remnant of Lemuria, was a relatively young volcanic formation, only a few 100,000 years old, and it was surrounded by ocean floor that dropped to depths of over 3,000 meters, just 20 or 30 kilometers from shore. When the French ethnographer Alfred Métraux visited Easter Island in the 1930s and carefully studied the moai, those famous stone statues with their brooding faces, he observed that they were concentrated along the island's current coastline. If the island had once been part of a much larger landmass that then sank, the statues would be distributed differently, following the pattern of the old shoreline now underwater. But they were not.
They marked the same coast that exists today, proving that the island's shape and size had changed little since the statues were carved. The so-called Triumphal Road that some writers claimed extended from Easter Island out into the now submerged lands around it was not a road at all, but a natural lava flow, a geological feature formed by the volcanic processes that created the island. The pukao, the cylindrical red stone topknots that sit atop some of the moai, were not made of red sandstone from some sunken continent, as James Churchward had incorrectly claimed. They were carved from red volcanic scoria, a type of rock produced by the very volcanoes that formed Easter Island. They were local, indigenous to the place, requiring no lost continent to explain their presence. Every feature that had been cited as evidence of Lemuria could be explained more simply and more accurately through conventional geology.
By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Lemuria as a scientific hypothesis was completely dead, not just doubted, but definitively disproven. No geologist took it seriously. No respectable scientific journal would publish papers advocating its existence. It had been relegated to the same category as the flat Earth and the geocentric solar system, ideas that once seemed plausible but had been overturned by better evidence and better theories. In the Tamil Nadu state of India, where the Kumari Kondam version of the Lemuria legend had been taught in schools as part of the nationalist narrative about Tamil civilization, the theory was finally removed from textbooks in the 1980s. Though it remained alive in popular imagination and in certain political circles. And yet, despite this scientific debunking, Lemuria did not disappear. If anything, its hold on the popular imagination seemed to grow stronger. Divorced from any need to conform to geological evidence, freed from the constraints of scientific scrutiny, Lemuria could become whatever people needed it to be. It could expand to encompass ever more elaborate mythologies, accumulate ever more detailed descriptions, serve ever more purposes in the spiritual and cultural lives of those who believed in it. The very fact that science rejected it became, for many believers, proof of its truth. Science, they argued, was too narrow, too materialistic, too bound by physical evidence to perceive deeper realities. The failure of scientists to find Lemuria simply meant they were looking in the wrong way, with the wrong tools, asking the wrong questions. This transformation from scientific hypothesis to spiritual belief system reveals something profound about human nature and human needs. We are storytelling creatures. We make sense of the world through narratives, and some narratives serve purposes that have nothing to do with whether they are factually accurate. The story of Lemuria, in all its varied forms, speaks to deep yearnings that mere facts cannot satisfy. It speaks to our desire to believe that humanity once lived in a golden age, a time of wisdom and harmony from which we have fallen, but to which we might someday return. It speaks to our hunger for meaning in a universe that science increasingly describes as vast, impersonal, and indifferent to human concerns. It speaks to our hope that we possess potentials we have not yet realized, capabilities that mainstream society tells us are impossible, but which might actually be dormant within us, waiting to be awakened. The appeal of lost continents is not limited to Lemuria, of course. Atlantis remains the most famous, the template against which all others are measured. Plato's account of Atlantis, written in ancient Athens as a philosophical dialogue exploring themes of hubris and divine justice, has spawned thousands of books, documentaries, and expeditions.
Some place Atlantis in the Mediterranean, perhaps the island of Santorini destroyed by a volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE. Others put it in the Atlantic Ocean, as Plato's text seems to suggest. Still others identify it with various ancient civilizations from Minoan Crete to the Indus Valley. The search for Atlantis continues, despite the lack of any convincing evidence, driven by the same forces that keep Lemuria alive in the imagination. But Atlantis and Lemuria serve somewhat different symbolic functions. Atlantis, in most tellings, represents technological achievement, military might, material splendor, and the dangers of pride and overreach. It is a cautionary tale about civilizations that become too powerful, too confident, too disconnected from the moral and spiritual foundations that should guide them. The Atlanteans built great machines and conquered distant lands, but they became corrupt, and the gods destroyed them for their arrogance. It is a very Western narrative in many ways, obsessed with power and its proper use, with the tension between human ambition and divine law. Lemuria, by contrast, especially in its occult formulations, represents something different. It is less about technology and more about spiritual development. The Lemurians are remembered not for their weapons or their buildings, but for their psychic abilities, their telepathy, their harmony with nature, their connection to cosmic consciousness. Where Atlantis fell because of moral corruption that followed material advancement, Lemuria fell because of the discovery of sexuality, because of the turn toward physical pleasure and away from spiritual purity. It is a more Eastern narrative in some ways, or at least one that incorporates themes more common in Hindu and Buddhist thought. Ideas about the dangers of desire and attachment, the superiority of the spiritual over the material, the fall from a higher state of consciousness into the illusions and sufferings of physical existence. These two lost continents, Atlantis in the Atlantic and Lemuria in the Pacific or Indian Ocean, also serve to balance the globe, to give the East its own primordial civilization to match the West's. When Tamil nationalists embraced the Kumari Kandam version of Lemuria, they were in part asserting that their culture and language were as ancient and as glorious as any in the world, that they need not see themselves as derivative or subordinate to the Sanskrit traditions of northern India or the civilizations of Europe. Lemuria gave them a narrative of origins that was their own, a deep history that placed Tamil people at the center rather than the periphery. It was a tool of cultural pride and resistance to narratives that marginalized or dismissed their achievements. The political uses of Lemuria in Tamil Nadu illustrate how myths, even discredited ones, can serve real functions in people's lives. The 1981 documentary film about Kumari Kandam, personally backed by the Chief Minister M.G. Ramachandran and screened at an international conference, attempted to combine continental drift theory with the sunken continent theory, suggesting that Lemuria could be reconciled with modern geology. The film depicted Kumari Kandam cities filled with gardens and mansions, centers of art and music and dance, a Tamil golden age destroyed by catastrophic floods. Though scholars dismissed it as pseudoscience, the film spoke to something its audience needed, a vision of their ancestors as cultured and accomplished, the inheritors of a great civilization, rather than a colonized people whose history began with the arrival of outsiders. Similar dynamics played out around Mount Shasta, though in different ways. The mountain became a pilgrimage site for spiritual seekers from around the world, people who came believing they might encounter Lemurians, receive teachings from Adama, or simply absorb the special energies that were said to emanate from the place. The city of Mount Shasta developed an economy partially based on the spiritual tourism. Crystal shops lined the main street, their windows full of quartz points and amethyst clusters, many labeled as Lemurian crystals, with special properties. These crystals, most of them actually mined in Brazil rather than having any connection to California or the Pacific, were said to have been programmed by the Lemurians with information and healing frequencies that could be accessed through meditation. Bookstores carried entire sections devoted to Lemuria, Telos, and the mountain's mysteries. Guided tours offered to take visitors to sites of special significance, to Pluto's cave, a lava tube near the base of the mountain that some believed might be an entrance to Telos, or to various locations around the slopes where Lemurians had supposedly been sighted. The 1987 event, known as the Harmonic Convergence, marked a turning point for Mount Shasta's reputation as a New Age destination.
This global meditation event, based on interpretations of Mayan calendar prophecy, drew thousands of people to sacred sites around the world, and Mount Shasta was identified as one of the most important of these locations, a major vortex of spiritual energy. News reports at the time called the gathering a spiritual Woodstock, and the influx of participants gave the mountain and the surrounding community a new identity in the popular consciousness. From that point forward, Mount Shasta was firmly established as a place where seekers came, where alternative spiritualities flourished, where the boundaries between the ordinary world and something more mysterious seemed thin and permeable. Not everyone in the local community welcomed this development.
Some longtime residents found the influx of New Age seekers strange or troublesome, worrying that the mountain was being loved to death by too many visitors, that fragile alpine ecosystems were being damaged by increased foot traffic, that the spiritual commercialization somehow cheapened the place. The Native American tribes, as mentioned, had their own complicated feelings, appreciating that at least some newcomers recognized the mountain as sacred, but frustrated that their own traditions were often ignored or appropriated in ways they found disrespectful. The Winnemem-Wintu, the Shasta, the Modoc, all these peoples had relationships with the mountain that went back countless generations, encoded in stories and ceremonies that predated European contact by thousands of years. The Lemurian legends, whatever else they might be, were not those stories. They were recent inventions, products of the late 19th and 20th centuries, owing more to theosophy and New Age syncretism than to any indigenous tradition. Yet there is something about Mount Shasta itself that seems to invite these projections, these stories of hidden realms and mysterious inhabitants. It is a genuinely awe-inspiring place, a mountain of almost perfect conical symmetry, rising in solitary grandeur above the surrounding landscape. Its glaciers gleam in the sunlight. Its summit often wears a crown of lenticular clouds that look otherworldly, like spacecraft hovering in place. Geologically, it is a stratovolcano, built up over hundreds of thousands of years by successive eruptions, though it is not currently active. Its last eruption was about 3,000 years ago, within the time that humans have inhabited the region, and the Native American stories about Scal and Lau, about spirits hurling fire at each other, almost certainly preserve memories of actual volcanic activity witnessed by ancestors. The forests around Mount Shasta are thick with Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere in certain areas where the trees grow tall and the understory remains open. There are meadows full of wildflowers in spring and summer. There are streams fed by melting snow, cold and pure. There are caves and lava tubes, dark passages through stone that really do extend deep into the mountain, created by the same volcanic processes that built the peak. Standing at the base looking up at the summit, or standing at the summit looking down at the world spread below, it is easy to understand why people feel something special about the place, why they come seeking transformation or transcendence, why they want to believe that something more than ordinary reality exists here, and perhaps, in a sense, something does. Not Lemurians with their crystal cities and their ancient wisdom, not physically real in the way that believers claim.
But the mountain is undeniably a focus for human yearning, a place where people come with questions about meaning and purpose, seeking experiences that transcend the mundane routines of daily life. The Lemurian legend provides a framework for those experiences, a story that gives shape to the nameless feelings that the mountain evokes. When someone meditating on the slopes of Mount Shasta feels a sense of peace or connection, when they have an insight that changes their perspective, when they experience something they cannot quite put into words, the Lemurian story offers an interpretation. It says you have touched something ancient, something real beyond the merely material, something that validates your sense that there is more to existence than what mainstream culture acknowledges. The broader phenomenon of New Age spirituality, of which the Lemurian legend is one small part,
represents in many ways a rejection of the worldview that modernity has constructed. Science and technology have brought enormous benefits, have lifted billions from poverty, cured diseases, extended lifespans, connected the world through communications networks that would have seemed magical to our ancestors. But they have also, many people feel, stripped the world of enchantment, reduced everything to mechanical processes and material causes, eliminated the sacred and the mysterious, in favor of explanations that are rationally satisfying, but emotionally and spiritually arid. If consciousness is just neurons firing, if love is just neurochemicals, if we are just meat machines that temporarily maintain their organization before decaying back into simple elements, then what is the point? Where is the meaning? How do we find purpose in a universe that science describes as vast beyond comprehension, but ultimately meaningless? The lost continent of Lemuria and the various teachings associated with it offer an alternative vision. They say that consciousness is primary, not derivative. They say that matter emerges from spirit, not spirit from matter. They say that we are fundamentally spiritual beings having temporary physical experiences, not physical beings with an illusion of spirituality. They promise that the material world we see is not all there is, that higher dimensions exist, that we have capacities science cannot measure, that ancient civilizations possessed wisdom modern society has lost. These claims cannot be proven by conventional means, but neither can they be definitively disproven. And for those who find the standard scientific worldview unsatisfying, they offer hope and meaning that feels more emotionally real than any amount of data about plate tectonics or evolutionary biology. It is worth noting, too, that the story of Lemuria exists within a broader context of legitimate mysteries and genuine losses. The oceans really have risen and fallen over the course of human history.
During the last ice age, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today because so much water was locked up in the great ice sheets that covered much of North America and Eurasia. The coastlines of the continents extended much farther out than they do now. Areas that are now shallow seas were dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The English Channel did not exist, and Britain was connected to continental Europe. Indonesia was part of a vast landmass called Sundaland that extended south from mainland Asia. The ancestors of Native Americans walked across a land bridge where the Bering Strait now flows. When the ice melted, beginning around 15,000 years ago and accelerating dramatically between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, the seas rose rapidly, drowning coastal areas around the world. Any human settlements on those coasts, any evidence of the people who lived there, now lies beneath meters of water and sediment. There really were floods, immense and devastating, that ancient peoples would have witnessed and remembered. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, still debated but supported by considerable evidence, suggests that the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake before being inundated by seawater from the Mediterranean around 5600 BCE, an event that would have been catastrophic for anyone living around its shores. Tsunami events, triggered by earthquakes and underwater landslides, periodically devastate coastal regions, destroying settlements and killing thousands. The ancient texts of various cultures, including the Tamil literature that mentions lands lost to the sea, may well preserve distorted memories of such events. Underwater archaeology has discovered genuine submerged settlements. Off the coast of India, near the Gulf of Combat, structures have been found that some researchers believe might be the remains of ancient cities, though this remains controversial. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument, a series of rock formations that appear to show evidence of carving and shaping, has been proposed by some as the remnant of a lost civilization, though most geologists believe it is a natural formation, with perhaps some minor human modification. In the Mediterranean, numerous ancient ports and settlements lie underwater, submerged either by tectonic subsidence or by the rising seas. These are real mysteries,
real instances of human history being swallowed by the oceans, and they demonstrate that the core idea behind the Lemuria legend, that lands have been lost beneath the waves, is not entirely fantasy. But these real sunken coasts and settlements are nothing like Lemuria as imagined by Blavatsky or Churchward. They are small, local, limited in extent, and dating to the relatively recent past, within the time frame of modern human civilization. They do not require continents to have appeared and disappeared. They do not involve advanced ancient civilizations with technologies surpassing our own.
They are the normal consequence of geological processes and sea level changes operating within the framework of plate tectonics, perfectly explainable through conventional science. The truth is remarkable enough without needing to invoke vanished continents or spiritually advanced giants. The 2013 geological discovery that briefly revived interest in Lemuria serves as a final illustration of how scientific findings can be misinterpreted or exaggerated to support pre-existing beliefs. In that year, researchers studying the ocean floor south of the island nation of Mauritius found fragments of ancient continental crust, zircon crystals that dated back billions of years. These fragments indicated that parts of a microcontinent they called Mauritia had once existed in the region before being submerged and covered by younger volcanic material. This was a genuine scientific finding, evidence of geological processes at work over immense timescales. Mauritia was part of Gondwana and broke apart when India separated from Madagascar. Over millions of years, it sank and was covered, leaving only scattered fragments detectable through careful study. Some news reports and websites presented this finding as vindication of the Lemuria theory, proof that a lost continent really had existed in the Indian Ocean, just as Sclater and the occultists had claimed. But this was a fundamental misunderstanding of what the science actually showed. Mauritia was not Lemuria. It existed in the wrong time period, hundreds of millions of years before humans evolved, let alone before any humans could have built cities or developed civilizations. It did not sink suddenly in a catastrophe, but subsided gradually over geological timescales. It was never a land bridge connecting Madagascar and India during the era of lemurs. And it certainly was not home to 15-foot-tall hermaphroditic egg-laying giants with telepathic powers. The discovery of Mauritia actually reinforced the plate tectonics explanation for the distribution of lemurs and other species, showing that the continents really had been connected in ways that made biological sense without requiring any Lemuria at all. Yet, for those already inclined to believe in Lemuria, the discovery of Mauritia seemed to offer scientific confirmation. It demonstrated once again how difficult it is to dislodge a cherished belief, how evidence that should disprove or at least complicate a theory can be reinterpreted to support it, how confirmation bias leads us to see what we expect to see and filter out information that does not fit our worldview. This is not a failing unique to believers in Lemuria or other alternative histories. It is a general feature of human cognition, something we all do to varying degrees. Scientists attempt to counteract it through rigorous methodology, peer review, replication, and the demand for evidence that can be independently verified. But in matters of belief that touch on identity, meaning, and purpose, the pull of the narrative we want to believe can be stronger than any amount of evidence to the contrary. So where does this leave us at the end of our long journey through the story of Lemuria? We have traveled from Victorian London and Philip Sclater's puzzle about lemur fossils, through Ernst Haeckel's speculations about human origins, into Helena Blavatsky's occult visions of root races and lost civilizations, across the Pacific to James Churchward's continent of Mu, and up the slopes of Mount Shasta to the supposed underground city of Telos. We have encountered Tamil nationalists and theosophists, channelers and seekers, geologists and archaeologists. We have seen how an idea can transform, how a scientific hypothesis can become a myth, how something created to solve a biological puzzle can end up serving as a vessel for human hopes and dreams that have nothing to do with lemurs or fossils. There is no Lemuria, not in the physical sense. The geological evidence is overwhelming and unambiguous. No continent sank beneath the Pacific or Indian Ocean within human history, or even within the last 100 million years. The distribution of lemurs and other species is explained perfectly well by plate tectonics and evolution, without needing any land bridges that later disappeared. The similarities in megalithic architecture and ancient symbolism across different cultures can be explained through universal patterns in human cognition, and the independent invention of similar solutions to similar problems, or in some cases through well-documented historical contexts, without requiring a shared origin in some lost primordial civilization. The moai of Easter Island were carved by Polynesian people, the descendants of master navigators who settled the Pacific through extraordinary feats of seamanship. And those statues tell their own remarkable story that needs no embellishment from Lemurian fantasy. There are no Lemurians living inside Mount Shasta, no matter how many people claim to have encountered them or received messages from them. The mountain is geologically young and volcanic in origin, its caves formed by lava flows, not by advanced civilizations excavating jeweled chambers. No telescope has ever revealed hidden cities on its slopes. The beings people believe they have seen or contacted are more plausibly explained as a combination of misidentification, wishful thinking, and the power of expectation to shape perception. When someone meditating at a location they believe to be sacred has an experience they interpret as contact with higher beings, what they are likely encountering is their own consciousness, their own unconscious mind speaking to them in the symbolic language of the stories they have internalized. That does not make the experience less real to them, but it does locate it in psychology rather than in objective external reality. And yet, to dismiss the Lemuria phenomenon entirely would be to miss something important about what it reveals. The persistence of this legend, its ability to adapt and survive and even thrive despite being scientifically debunked, tells us something about the human need for mystery, for meaning, for stories that connect us to something larger than ourselves. We are meaning-making creatures. We cannot help but construct narratives to explain our existence and our place in the cosmos. When the dominant narratives of our culture fail to satisfy us, we create new ones or revive old ones, seeking frameworks that address not just what we know, but how we feel and what we hope. The Lemurian legend serves multiple functions for different people. For some, it is quite literally true, a hidden history that will someday be vindicated when the right evidence is discovered or when humanity's consciousness evolves sufficiently to perceive the truths that are currently hidden. For others, it is a metaphor, a symbolic representation of lost potential, of aspects of human nature that our civilization has suppressed or forgotten in its rush toward technological progress and material accumulation. For still others, it is a useful fiction, a story that inspires and uplifts, even if it is not factually accurate, much as we can be moved by a novel or a film despite knowing it is invented. And for some, it is simply entertainment, an amusing diversion, a what-if that makes the world more interesting without requiring actual belief. The various Lemurian narratives also serve to connect people to place in powerful ways. Mount Shasta is not just a mountain to those who believe in telos. It is a threshold, a portal, a living presence that can transform those who approach it with the right attitude.
The act of pilgrimage, of traveling to a location because one believes it is special, creates a framework for experience that can indeed be transformative. Setting aside time from normal life, journeying to a place of natural beauty, spending hours in meditation or contemplation, opening oneself to the possibility of insights and revelations, these practices can genuinely change people, regardless of whether the specific beliefs that motivated them are accurate. The mountain does not need to actually contain a hidden city for someone to have a meaningful experience there. The power is in the intention, the attention, the willingness to step outside ordinary consciousness and see what happens. This is true, of course, for sacred sites and pilgrimage locations around the world, regardless of the religious or spiritual tradition involved. People travel to Mecca, to Jerusalem, to Varanasi, to Bodh Gaya, to Lourdes, to Icy, to countless other places, believing that these locations are special, that being present in them can bring one closer to the divine or the transcendent. Some of these beliefs are backed by long-established religious traditions with ancient roots.
Others, like the Lemurian legends of Mount Shasta, are of more recent vintage, but the psychological and spiritual dynamics are similar. Place becomes meaningful through the stories we tell about it, and those stories then shape how we experience the place, creating a feedback loop that reinforces belief. The indigenous peoples who consider Mount Shasta sacred have their own ways of relating to the mountain, ways that predate the Lemurian legends by millennia. Their traditions speak of the mountain as alive, as conscious, as demanding respect and proper behavior from those who enter its domain. These are relationships built over countless generations of living in proximity to the mountain, of observing its moods and its dangers, of incorporating it into the fundamental structures of culture and identity. When Colleen Sisk says that the Winnemem Wintu came out of the mountain, she is not making a claim about hidden cities or lost continents. She is speaking of something much deeper, a relationship of origin and belonging that defines what it means to be Winnemem Wintu. The mountain is not just a place, it is part of who they are. The tension between these indigenous relationships with place and the New Age appropriations of those places is one of the more troubling aspects of the Lemuria phenomenon. Too often, non-indigenous people take elements of Native American spirituality, strip them of their cultural context, mix them with ideas from theosophy or channeled teachings or pure imagination, and present the resulting syncretism as ancient wisdom while ignoring or dismissing the actual living traditions of the people who originated those ideas. This is a form of cultural appropriation that can be harmful even when done with good intentions. It erases or marginalizes indigenous voices while simultaneously claiming authority from an imagined indigenous past. It takes what belongs to specific peoples and makes it generic, available for anyone to use however they wish, divorced from the responsibilities and relationships that give it meaning in its original context. At the same time, it is worth acknowledging that the hunger for spiritual connection, for meaningful relationship with the natural world, for practices and beliefs that address the whole person rather than just the rational mind, these are legitimate needs that modern Western culture often fails to meet. The people who come to Mount Shasta seeking Lemurians are, in many cases, searching for something that mainstream society tells them does not exist. They are looking for enchantment in a disenchanted world, for meaning in a culture that often reduces everything to economics and utility, for community with others who share their sense that there must be more to existence than what is visible on the surface. The specific beliefs may be mistaken, but the needs are real, and dismissing those needs as simply foolish or deluded misses the point.
What might be more helpful is to recognize the difference between metaphorical truth and literal truth. between truth that serves the spirit and truth that serves the intellect. Science is extraordinarily good at answering questions about how the world works, about the mechanisms and processes that govern physical reality. It is less equipped to answer questions about meaning, purpose, beauty, morality, about how we should live and what makes life worth living. These are not scientific questions. They are philosophical, ethical, aesthetic, and spiritual questions, and they require different approaches. The story of Lemuria, understood as a myth rather than as a historical claim, can speak to genuine truths about the human condition, even if it tells us nothing accurate about geology or prehistory. The idea of a golden age from which we have fallen is a very old one, appearing in traditions around the world, from the Greek myth of the ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, to the Hindu concept of the yugas, the great cycles of time in which righteousness and human capacity gradually decline from an initial perfection. These myths express something we feel deeply, the sense that something has been lost, that our ancestors possessed wisdom or virtues or connections to the sacred that we have somehow misplaced. Whether this represents actual historical truth is less important than what it reveals about our sense of alienation from nature, from each other, from ourselves. The Lemurian emphasis on spiritual development, on consciousness evolution, on the idea that humanity is destined to transcend its current limitations and achieve higher states of being, speaks to our dissatisfaction with things as they are, and our hope that transformation is possible. We look at the world with its wars and injustices, its suffering and stupidity, and we want to believe that we can do better, that we are capable of more. The story of root races ascending through stages of spiritual evolution is one way of framing that hope, of saying that current conditions are not permanent, that change is not only possible, but inevitable, that the arc of cosmic history bends toward enlightenment, even if the journey is long and difficult. These are powerful ideas, and they meet real psychological and spiritual needs, even if the specific form in which they are expressed, the literal belief in Lemuria as a historical place, is not supported by evidence. The challenge is to find ways to honor and explore these themes, these perennial human concerns about meaning and purpose and potential, without requiring beliefs that contradict well-established scientific understanding. It is possible to recognize that we are part of a vast cosmic story, that the universe has evolved over billions of years to produce stars and planets and eventually life and consciousness, and to find in that scientifically accurate story as much wonder and meaning as any myth can provide.
The fact that we are made of atoms forged in the hearts of ancient stars, that the calcium in our bones and the iron in our blood were created in supernova explosions, that we are quite literally the universe becoming conscious of itself, these truths are as profound as anything imagined by Blavatsky or Churchward. The real story of how life spread across the earth, how continents drift and species evolve and ecosystems develop, is endlessly fascinating when you actually pay attention to it. The ancestors of lemurs did not walk across a land bridge from Lemuria to Madagascar. They rafted across the Mozambique Channel on floating vegetation, arriving on the island perhaps 60 million years ago when Africa and Madagascar were closer together than they are now, and once there, they diversified into dozens of species, each adapted to particular niches in Madagascar's unique ecosystems. That is the actual story, and it is remarkable, a testament to the power of evolution and the opportunism of life, which finds ways to spread into every available habitat given enough time. The ancestors of modern humans, our very own ancestors, walked out of Africa over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, spreading gradually across the Middle East and into Asia and eventually Europe, Australia, and the Americas, adapting to every environment from rainforest to tundra, developing different physical characteristics in response to different climates and different diets, but remaining fundamentally one species, one human family whose genetic variation is surprisingly shallow because we are all so recently related. That journey, that diaspora from Africa to the entire planet is the true epic of human origins, and it needed no lost continents, no ancient civilizations with forgotten wisdom. It was accomplished by people like us, with brains like ours, facing challenges we can barely imagine, driven by the same curiosity and adaptability and sheer stubbornness that characterizes our species today. The stone circles and megaliths that dot the landscape of ancient cultures, from Stonehenge to the Moai of Easter Island to the temples of Malta, were built by humans using human ingenuity, human labor, human cooperation, and human determination. We do not need to invoke Lemurian architects or Atlantean engineers to explain these monuments. The people who built them were our peers, our equals in intelligence and creativity, working with the knowledge and tools they had developed through generations of accumulated experience. To attribute their achievements to some outside influence, some lost civilization that taught them what they needed to know, is actually to diminish those achievements, to rob our ancestors of credit for what they accomplished through their own efforts. Yet there remains something haunting about the Lemuria legend, something that lingers even after all the debunking and explanation. It speaks to the question of what has been lost that we might someday recover.
Not lost continents or hidden cities or ancient technologies, but perhaps lost ways of relating to the world, lost modes of consciousness that valued things our culture has pushed to the margins. The modern world, for all its achievements, has paid certain costs. We have lost intimacy with nature, most of us living in environments almost entirely shaped by human hands, rarely encountering wilderness or animals in their native habitats. We have lost connection to the rhythms of day and night, the seasons, the cycles of growth and decay that governed all human life until very recently. We have lost certain kinds of knowledge that oral cultures possessed, the ability to navigate by stars and weather signs, to identify hundreds of plants and their uses, to tell stories that carried the accumulated wisdom of ancestors across generations. We have also, perhaps, lost certain capacities for awe and wonder that come more easily when the world is not fully explained, when mystery surrounds us on all sides, when the sacred has not been pushed out of everyday life and relegated to a few hours on weekends in specialized buildings. Indigenous cultures, including those around Mount Shasta, maintained ways of being in the world that modern industrial societies have largely abandoned, ways that recognized the sacred in nature, that treated the land as alive and deserving of respect, that saw human beings as part of a larger web of relationships, rather than as separate from and superior to the rest of creation. The longing for Lemuria might be, in part, a longing for those lost relationships, for a way of being human that is less alienated, less isolated, more embedded in the living world. If this is true, then perhaps the real wisdom is not to be found in believing literally in Lemuria, but in asking what the legend is trying to tell us, what need it arises from, and how we might address that need more directly. Instead of seeking ancient civilizations that never existed, we might look to indigenous peoples who still maintain relationships with the land that industrial culture has abandoned, learning from them with humility and respect, supporting their sovereignty and their efforts to protect sacred sites from destruction. Instead of channeling messages from imaginary Lemurians, we might practice meditation and contemplation in ways that connect us more deeply to our own inner wisdom, to the still small voice that speaks when we quiet the chatter of the surface mind. Instead of waiting for a lost golden age to be rediscovered, or for our consciousness to suddenly evolve into a higher dimension, we might do the hard work of making this world, this dimension, this moment, more just and compassionate and sustainable. The mountains will still be there to inspire us.
Mount Shasta will still rise above the forests of Northern California, snow-covered and serene, beautiful in a way that needs no embellishment, sacred in its own right, without requiring stories of hidden cities to make it worthy of reverence. The ocean depths will still hold genuine mysteries worth exploring, remnants of actual human history waiting to be discovered, real questions about how life adapted to the most extreme environments on Earth. The story of evolution, the story of continental drift, the story of humanity's spread across the planet. These true stories are as filled with drama and wonder as any legend, and they have the additional virtue of being supported by evidence, of being genuine chapters in the actual history of our world, rather than projections of our wishes and fears. But stories will continue to be told. Humans cannot help it. We will always make up tales to explain what we do not understand, to express what we hope for, to warn against what we fear. The legend of Lemuria will likely persist, adapting and changing as it has throughout its history, serving the needs of future generations as it has served the needs of those who have come before. Perhaps someday it will be remembered as we now remember the gods of Olympus or the Norse Valhalla as mythological rather than historical, appreciated for its symbolic and artistic value rather than believed as literal truth. Or perhaps it will continue to attract literal believers, people for whom the material world is too barren to accept and who need to believe in something more, something that science cannot measure, but which feels more real to them than any amount of data or evidence. In the end, each person must decide for themselves what to believe, what framework makes sense of their experience, what stories give their lives meaning. We can insist on evidence and rationality, on skepticism toward extraordinary claims, on the importance of distinguishing between what we want to be true and what actually is true. We should do this. The pursuit of truth is valuable, not just for its practical applications, but for its own sake, because it is better to understand the world as it is than to live in comforting illusions. But we should also have compassion for those whose needs are not met by materialism alone, who seek in myths and legends the enchantment and meaning that the modern world often fails to provide. The hunger for the sacred is not foolish. The desire for connection to something larger than ourselves is not weakness. These are human universals, as fundamental to our nature as the need for food or shelter or love. So let us return, as we draw toward the close of our long journey, to where we began, to Victorian London and Philip Sclater puzzling over his lemurs, setting in motion a chain of transformations that would carry his modest hypothesis into realms he never imagined. To the mountains and oceans of our beautiful planet, whose real history is so much longer and stranger than any human story. To the people who come to Mount Shasta seeking something they cannot name, standing on its slopes and feeling something stir within them, whether it is called Lemurian contact, or divine presence, or simply the effect of natural beauty and silence on the cluttered mind. To all of us, trying to make sense of existence, constructing stories that help us navigate between birth and death, between the known and unknown, between the world as it appears and the world as we hope it might be. The continent of Lemuria never existed, but the search for it has been real. The hidden city of Telos is a fiction, but the mountain beneath which it supposedly lies is solid granite and ancient ice. The Lemurians of Blavatsky's vision were never born, but the human longing they represent is as old as consciousness itself. We are the seekers and the storytellers, the question and the answer, the mountain and the climber. We carry within us the entire history of the cosmos, the 14 billion years from the Big Bang to this present moment, the long, slow evolution from simple elements to complex molecules to living cells to conscious beings capable of wondering where we came from and where we might be going. Perhaps that is the real truth behind all lost continent legends. We are searching for ourselves, for the parts of human nature and human potential that we sense but cannot fully access. that glimmer at the edges of awareness like a city half glimpsed through morning mist. We project these qualities onto imagined civilizations of the past because it is easier than acknowledging that the wisdom we seek is not lost, but simply difficult. Not hidden in underground caverns, but buried under the accumulated habits and assumptions of ordinary consciousness. The journey to Lemuria is inward, not outward. The treasures of Telos are metaphorical, not literal. The transformation we undergo when we climb the mountain is psychological and spiritual, not a matter of entering a different physical dimension. And with that understanding, we can appreciate the Lemuria legend for what it truly is, a mirror reflecting human aspirations, a vehicle for exploring ideas about consciousness and civilization and the relationship between spirit and matter, a story that has evolved over more than a century and a half from scientific hypothesis to occult doctrine to New Age mythology to commercial enterprise, accumulating meanings and serving purposes that change with each generation that encounters it. It is a remarkable cultural artifact, worth studying not because it tells us anything accurate about the Earth's geological past, but because it tells us so much about the human present, about what we desire and what we fear, about the stories we tell to make sense of our place in the cosmos. The night grows deep now.
The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that shone on the Lemurians if they had existed, the same stars that shine on us now, composed of the same elements, following the same laws of physics, beautiful and indifferent to human concerns. The mountain sleeps beneath its mantle of snow, patient and enduring, shaped by fire and ice across the millennia, sacred to those who recognize the sacred in nature, mysterious in the way that all wild places are mysterious, full of genuine wonders that need no embellishment from legend. The ocean depths keep their secrets, the secrets of geological processes and biological adaptations, of submerged coastlines and drowned valleys, of real history that speaks in the language of sediments and fossils, rather than the language of myth. And somewhere, someone is reading about Lemuria for the first time, feeling that thrill of discovery, that sense of hidden knowledge revealed, beginning their own journey through this remarkable story. They will make of it what they need, find in it what they seek, whether that is literal belief or metaphorical truth, or simply an entertaining diversion from the difficulties of ordinary life. The legend continues, adapting, evolving, serving whatever purpose each new generation requires of it, as immortal in its own way as any lost continent is supposed to have been, except that its immortality lives not in physical stone, but in human imagination, passed from mind to mind, from book to book, from teacher to student, from believer to seeker, endlessly renewed, endlessly transformed. So rest now. Let these stories wash over you like waves on an ancient shore. Let your mind drift like a continent across the mantle of sleep. The mysteries remain, but they are gentler than the legends suggest, more patient, more forgiving of our human need to construct meaning from fragments and hints. Tomorrow will bring its own questions, its own searches, its own small discoveries of what is true and what is imagined. But for now, there is only the soft darkness, the quiet breath, the slow descent into dreams, where perhaps you will walk through forests at the foot of a great mountain, or swim through sunlit waters above a drowned land, or simply rest in peace, released from the need to know, content in the eternal present that existed before Lemuria and will exist long after its last believer has forgotten the name. If you found peace in this long tale, if these words have carried you toward the shores of sleep, then perhaps before you drift away completely, you might consider leaving a small sign of your passage, a like to mark that you were here, a subscription to say you might return. But these are small things, optional,
unimportant, really, in the greater scheme. What matters is the journey we've taken together, from Victorian science to mountain peaks, from ancient oceans to the depths of human longing, and the rest you've earned by listening so long and so patiently. The story is told.
The mysteries remain mysteries. The mountain stands, the stars shine, and sleep, that nightly dissolution into the unconscious depths, awaits to receive you, as it has received countless seekers before, as it will receive countless seekers yet to come, in the endless cycle of waking and sleeping, of questioning and resting, that marks our brief passage through this strange and beautiful world. Rest well, traveler. The lost continent of Lemuria never was, but your journey to its shores has been real enough. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed, ready to face the genuine wonders of the actual world, which are more than sufficient for a lifetime of discovery. Good night.